Welcome to the Political Risk Podcast, a risk, insurance, and geopolitics mix. I'm your host, David Benyon. My guest is Hamish Greenwood, Head of Crisis Management at McGill and Partners. The topic is Ukraine and a new war risk reinsurance facility for commercial property assets in Ukraine, which McGill, a broker, launched in January. This new offering is the first of its kind, leveraging AI-powered technology to enhance the understanding and the underwriting of commercial property risks in the country. It involves a few partnerships which we'll explore. The first of these is focused on data and technology. It's a partnership with FortuneGuard, a Ukrainian insurtech startup and a graduate of the Lloyd's Lab incubator for insurtechs. FortuneGuard uses Ukrainian government data on the missiles and the drones fired by Russia into the country to assess the likelihood of war damage, working alongside McGill to support placement and underwriting via the facility. McGill has also collaborated with a local Ukrainian insurer, ARX, to create a product that will enable up to $50 million in coverage to be offered per risk, with reinsurance capacity provided by several London Market and Lloyd syndicates. We recorded this episode on the 3-year anniversary to the day of Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, with fighting still very much going on, more than 3 years after Vladimir Putin launched his plan to conquer Kyiv in 3 days. Clearly, events are moving fast, however, with regards to the increasingly erratic moves of the Trump administration, the opening of pre-negotiations dialogue, talks about talks, between the US and Russia, notably excluding Ukraine, crisis talks in response by European leaders, and Ukraine finding itself under intense pressure on the battlefield and in diplomatic terms to negotiate with the Russian aggressor. There's a lot going on in this space. It's a fascinating conversation. I hope you enjoy it. Hamish, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
No matter all this chaotic atmosphere, it's clear that there are no concrete outcomes yet. It's really difficult to tell where all this is headed. And even if a peace deal is reached, there's going to be so much uncertainty beyond that. So how do you see insurance playing its role in managing risk in Ukraine during and after this conflict?
I think the key thing you've said there is uncertainty, and there is massive uncertainty in the country and the outcomes at the moment. And insurance is meant to be there as protection against uncertainty. And in Ukraine, I think it's incredibly important at the moment. Anything we can offer now in terms of protection to businesses trying to get through this particularly challenging period will build in huge resilience to the economy. Arguably, where insurance is almost going to be more important is after some sort of deal is made and we start to see investment and rebuilding occurring. Most of that foreign aid and investment will probably come with lender provisions and insurance requirements. And I think that's where insurance is going to have to play a massive role in order to secure that funding coming into the country and helping to rebuild Ukraine.
Before we go any further, it's good to get some context about yourself as well. So, Head of Crisis Management at McGill, what's the scope of your role at the broker and also the book of client business that you're responsible for placing?
So I joined McGill almost 4 years ago now to build the crisis management team and the product lines that fall under that. So there's political violence, strikes, riots, civil commotion, terrorism, and then we also do contingency, event cancellation, K&R fall into that as well. And I came over to build a team that really focuses on the most complex risks where we can really add the most value as a political violence broker, as a crisis management broker. And that complexity can be in terms of scale of client, can be occupancy, or in the case of Ukraine, for example, it's territorial exposure that can really add complexity. And over the 4 years that I've been running the team, that's where I've really found we differentiate ourselves as one of the most complex clients out there.
So Hamish, you previously worked at Willis and you worked at RFIB, two well-known broking names in the London market. Please walk us through your career background before your current role.
So yeah, I started at RFIB having turned down a role on a second ski season, which I'd be lying if I said I didn't regret for the first 3 months of my time in insurance, because I found myself in the accident and health market, which was a little dry in terms of subject matter and didn't get many responsibilities early on. And then the opportunity to move into the political violence market opened up, and I found a relatively young market who were a friendly bunch. You got a lot of responsibility early on. So that was how I got my first look into the crisis management world. Then after 5 years at RFIB, moved over to Willis to work with a really good team there, working on some of the more larger, complex clients, and then was finally given the opportunity to move over and start up the team at McGill. So yeah, it's the route I've taken to get to where I am now.
So let's talk about the new Ukraine war risk reinsurance facility launched in January. Firstly, why was it necessary?
So effectively, following the full-scale invasion into Ukraine by Russia, we saw a near total exclusion of the territory, predominantly driven by the reinsurance market. That meant the direct market couldn't offer significant capacity, or even in most cases any capacity, to risks in Ukraine. And in the absence of international reinsurance capacity, the country and businesses in the country just had to wear the risk on their balance sheet. And that happened for a number of years. And then we saw local insurance markets like ARX, our partner there, start to offer a product called the War Risk product, which effectively focused on covering businesses for physical damage as a result of missiles, drones, and air defense wreckage. So focusing on that kind of longer range threat that was present, especially in Kiev and also in all parts of the country, really. Now, having looked at that and seen what was going on there, we started making inquiries and had discussions with people. We'd always felt that the blanket exclusion of Ukraine was a bit knee-jerk, should we say. It's a vast territory. It's over 1,250 kilometers across. That's roughly from Warsaw to Brussels. It's 600,000 kilometers squared. It's a vast territory, and risks that are in your eastern regions do not reflect the risks that are in the west of the country. And so applying a blanket, we're not writing anything there approach didn't seem very fair, and it didn't seem in line with the Lloyd's approach, where we like to try and price everything, insure the uninsurable, and that sort of approach that Lloyd's tends to pride itself on. So we got to work on the problem and sort of realized that while that theory of the West being much less risky than the East was an obvious one, we needed data to back that up. And that's where some of the work done by the Ukrainian government very early on in the war has really started to pay dividends. They kept a huge database of projectiles coming over and where these impacts had occurred in Ukraine. And it allows you to paint a really clear picture and categorize the regions in terms of how badly affected they've been. And it allowed us to put a proposition in front of underwriters that was data-driven and showed that there are territories in Ukraine that are largely unimpacted by this war. And as a result, there are insurable assets in there. And there are businesses that need this protection to protect against the uncertainty of these drones coming across and missiles. So understanding that the local market had a solution, but was only able to offer very small limits, up to $500,000, we then put this kind of data-driven approach in front of underwriters and managed to get support from a group of Lloyd's syndicates to offer risks of up to $50 million to sit in excess of the local market, and to ensure these larger assets that are in parts of Ukraine that, whilst definitely under threat, are still insurable propositions. And that naturally means around Kiev and further west of that is sort of what falls into that insurable proposition. If you go east of that, it becomes much more challenging to find those insurable propositions.
The local partner, obviously ARX you mentioned, is that a Ukrainian insurer?
Yes, that's the local Ukrainian insurer.
And obviously they've got the database that the Ukrainian government's been working on. So as you mentioned, a lot of detail about all the missile paths and hits in 3 years, right?
It's publicly accessible, so everyone can request access to that.
Let's talk about the London market reinsurers involved. I understand you can't name names, but yeah, how many of them are involved?
Yeah, so we have 6 Lloyd's partners and 1 company market. Yeah, so that's participation we have at the moment. We're very aware that the markets that committed initially when we start using up their aggregate with risks, we're going to need to find more capacity. So it's a constant process that we're undergoing, is finding more partners who are willing to offer capacity to support risks in Ukraine. So that's an ongoing job that I always have going in the background at the moment.
How much volume of business has gone through the facility so far?
Yeah, so since we've launched, we've quoted cover on over $1.7 billion worth of assets in Ukraine. And that's split across probably 30 accounts, I think, at the moment.
What kinds of businesses or assets are actually seeking this coverage? What are you protecting?
Yeah, we see a very broad range of assets coming in for cover. We've specifically kept the appetite on the way in broad. We want to assess every risk on its own merits. Some kind of themes that come through. We've seen a fair amount of energy assets. I think it's safe to say that the more traditional power assets are out of scope. They're under attack so much at the moment, it doesn't make them insurable. But there's a lot of renewables in Ukraine. So we see a lot of solar plants and wind assets as well that are in potentially less risky areas, potentially have foreign investment as well, and so are looking for cover. Large manufacturing is another area where we've seen inquiries come in, and that can be in wood manufacturing. We've seen bottling plants, we've seen building materials manufacturers, that sort of stuff. And these are types of businesses, especially on those kind of building materials side, the manufacturing businesses are going to be incredibly important throughout the next few years as well. And then we do also see a fair amount of retail exposure, and that tends to be in Kiev, which is challenging and expensive, but we are offering terms. It just, the price tends to be a bit prohibitive at the moment in central Kiev and government areas.
There's a cancellation provision, right? So if the line of contact moves within 100 kilometers, I think, of the insured asset. Yeah, so how does that help balance the needs of businesses with the realities of the conflict?
Yeah, so I think the reason the market wholesale pulled out of Ukraine was they were very concerned about this war scenario where a whole country or cities, towns were leveled and multiple insured assets that they built on their books were just entirely wiped out. And that caused that kind of catastrophic loss that they wouldn't be able to manage. And that potentially caused the reaction it did. So we're very aware, looking at how to get the market back into Ukraine, we needed to give them the ability to manage that kind of catastrophic loss scenario. That catastrophic loss scenario can only really occur if cities or towns come within artillery range, which is generally seen to be around the 60-kilometer mark, the very far end of that. So what is built into the policy that has been put together is that if the line of contact moves within 100 kilometers of an insured asset, then underwriters come off risk and the policy is refunded on a pro rata basis. It's just not the risk that the underwriters are willing to cover at the moment. We're willing to cover the longer range risk and that exposure, but the catastrophic loss scenario isn't manageable at the moment. And so that's why that provision has to be in there.
People trot out that phrase about, you can't buy fire insurance on a house that's already on fire. But I think there's a world of difference, isn't there, between insuring a business in Ukraine that's all the way in Lviv versus something that's in artillery range.
And the strike data actually will show you what's really interesting around the data in that database. Shows you that there are regions much further east than Lviv, for example, which have seen much less action, far fewer hits. And so while the theory that the West is the best basically is broadly, there are actually regions right next to Kiev that have experienced less impact from the war than some of the westernmost regions as well.
And that database that the Ukrainian government runs, does that basically tell you every hit, so a whole range of different asset types, whatever's been struck by a drone or a missile? Having not seen it, it'd be good to get a little bit of background on that.
Yeah, it's effectively a heat map of where these projectiles have landed. You can filter by time, you can filter by region. It will give you a rough idea of the occupancy that was damaged if an asset was hit, for example. It's very comprehensive. It's quite depressing in the east of the country, to be honest. It's a very, very hot heat map, as it were. But when you're analysing risk around Kiev and further west, it's a very useful tool in certainly seeing patterns and trends around assets and being able to assign and filter out those risks and differentiate certain risks from other ones.
You mentioned the partners for the facility. But the technology partner, FortuneGuard, let's talk about that for a little bit as we're getting into the data side of this. So am I right in thinking it's AI-driven risk analysis?
Yeah, FortuneGuard's a super interesting company. Alexei, the founder, used to run a pretty successful business in the Kharkiv area, and unfortunately his business was devastated. And as a result, he started looking at what was available to insure businesses against the very thing that had effectively destroyed his business. So this kind of pushed him on to the war risks insurance side of things. And he was working with ARX, actually secured a place at the Lloyd's lab in their latest cohort to come to London and try to build out support for this peril in Ukraine. And while that was happening, we were working from the other side, trying to find local partners to deploy the capacity that we were trying to secure in London anyway. So it was a nice meet in the middle. And one of the things that FortuneGuard do really well is they are able to analyze risk and very quickly run it against this database, look at prior strike data. They deploy AI to map where local energy structure is, key targets, critical infrastructure, and they put all of that proximity and data into a very easily digestible risk report for the underwriters. And that saves them a lot of time and allows them to compare risks on a like for like. I think one of the things that's very challenging for underwriters in territories like Ukraine is you don't get uniformity of submission at all. You get bits and bobs of information, and they have to do an enormous amount of work on individual assets in order to try and get to a price. So what FortuneGuard do in this risk assessment of individual assets really aims to take a lot of that work away from the underwriters and put them in the best possible position to release a price and release capacity.
Seeing as a lot of my time now, I do, because this podcast, talk to people like yourself and underwriters in the war, political violence and terrorism space. And I always find myself asking this question about, the balance between not quite a seat of the pants underwriting, but for the underwriters anyway, obviously knowledge and expertise, but also because the wider insurance market, we're bombarded by people talking about data-led underwriting and data analytics. And it always seems to me an interesting question in this line of business because there's often not so much data. It's very hard to model. So yeah, it's fascinating to see new work being done.
Simply put, in most territories, there haven't been enough losses to accurately build up a model. And so this arguably is an instance where modeling can be incredibly effective and risk analysis can be incredibly effective to differentiate risks.
It's a shame that in this case, it takes what it takes to build up that data, but it's essentially 3 years of a hot war in a European country. And then suddenly you have the data for a model.
Yeah, and serious credit to the Ukrainian government for the foresight of seeing that early on and mapping what they have. It's certainly allowed us to do what we have, having that resource there.
You mentioned about the pricing differentiation, before all that data versus after, when you have a lot more uniformity and a lot more actual data to draw on. What kind of differentiation are we talking about there? How much difference does it make?
I'll try not to give away too much sensitive information for my competitors, but it does make a pretty big difference, to be honest. Previously, we were looking at individual accounts that were coming in and wanting to buy one-off coverages on our standard set wordings, and you'd see the $100 million limits and people were wanting $10 million of premium. So that gives you an idea of how expensive it was. And unfortunately, that just meant that any Ukrainian business was totally priced out of buying the cover, and the capacity was very small as well. So that drove price. What we've done here is take away the catastrophic exposure a little bit to underwriters. We've packaged up how we submit everything and provided good risk analytics. And the whole goal of that is to bring it to an affordability level that Ukrainian businesses can afford. And we're still fighting that battle. It's tough at the moment. You've had 3 years of an ongoing war and no readily available cover. So businesses have been without this coverage and they've survived a lot of the time. Maybe that's on us for not providing the solution earlier. And so I think now we're coming to market with this solution, and there are definitely businesses that are buying the cover, but there's also a lot who've sort of said, well, we've survived so far, so maybe we'll keep getting away with it. So it's the constant battle we have. I think if you look relative to other territories that have experienced conflict recently, Israel, probably one of the best examples. After the outbreak of the war there, rates were in that kind of 3 to 5% range. It's not dissimilar in terms of where we've managed to get the rates to in Ukraine. And I think, to be fair, a lot of the time, I think that is a fair price. If you break that down into a year's event for underwriters, it's probably relatively hard to argue. The risk is less than a 1 in 50, should we say.
I know that you were also planning an event in Ukraine last year, but you had to postpone or in fact cancel it. So what's the situation with regards to that? Whether it's something in Kiev or Lviv, do you still plan to go?
Definitely. I mean, I think one of the most important things is building relationships face to face and showing support in territories where they really need us and showing our value to them face to face, building those connections. And what we were planning to do midway through last year, when admittedly the conflict had cooled down a little bit, was to go out and meet the local insurance industry, meet the local brokers, meet the clients, and show them that Lloyd's capacity and London capacity was still here and we had solutions and we were willing to offer them. And I think that will still be incredibly valuable to do, whether that happens in the next couple of months or shortly after a deal has been done. It's certainly an area I'd love to go out to, and especially with the partners we've got now who are on the ground. You dial into calls with them and they're talking about the strikes that have happened overnight and alerts going off on their phone. And yeah, I'd certainly like to meet them in person and have a chat. And it's tough for a lot of them to get over to the UK. Fortunately, a few of them have been able to get visas. I think Lloyd's have helped quite a lot with that. Obviously, leaving the country when you're a fighting age male is tough. I think as soon as the security situation allows, we'll be out there meeting our partners, showing our support for them.
Previous events, you went to South Africa, for instance. That's a country where you had the Zuma riots in 2021. Obviously, a very different type of event, SRCC claims in that case. But what do you sort of gain from getting out there that you don't by, as we are this morning, sitting in London? And sort of work that into what your goals therefore would be when it comes to getting out into Ukraine when you can.
Yes, I think South Africa is a great country, to be honest. I think it gets a tough rep sometimes. I think people's perception on paper of South Africa can be a little misleading. It's an amazing country and I love getting down there. I think they're incredibly easy to do business with. They're very direct, say what they want, and if you deliver, you do well with them. I think delivering tough messages is where the face-to-face interaction really pays off. Once you build a relationship with someone face-to-face, you can have those harder conversations. Sending an email from London when you don't have that sort of a relationship can make it a little bit more challenging and a bit more fractious. So I've always been a big fan of going down, seeing our clients, understanding what their concerns are as well. It's very hard to convey over email exactly what clients need. When you're in the territory and you spend time with your clients and you understand the risks that they face, you can start to make products that they really want to buy. So I think that's an incredibly important thing that we want to do in Ukraine as well. What we're offering at the moment is what we're able to offer, but it's a very uncertain situation. It will pick up on a lot of concerns and a lot of needs of clients if we get out there and can talk to them. If we can talk to the local insurers, we can talk to direct clients, brokers, we're really going to understand what that market needs. There's a local market there at the moment which is providing capacity and coping on a lot of lines of business. So I think getting out there and understanding where they really need us rather than forcing what we think they need upon them is really important to kind of building back that relationship between London and the Ukrainian market, because I think it has been slightly damaged by the kind of exclusion of the territory for 3 years.
And also, I assume other local carriers too. You already have ARX, but would you want to see other Ukrainian local insurers come on board?
Yeah, 100%. It's quite a collaborative environment in the Ukrainian insurance market, and ARX didn't want exclusivity over this. They were more of the view that the wider we can distribute the coverage, the better. And we're very much that opinion as well. We want to offer this to as many clients as possible. via as many carriers as possible locally. So we're very willing to work with new carriers. And I think that would be part of going out there, is making these new connections and building relationships with local carriers, and hopefully distributing the product wider and using insurance to kind of build more resilience into the economy.
Well, look, suffice to say, Hamish, I hope you do get out there to see your clients and prospects and form new partnerships this year. It's certainly a difficult situation on the ground in Ukraine. And as you say, very uncertain. We don't know what will happen, but therein lies the value of insurance or insurance. So thank you very much. I appreciate you coming on the pod.
Thanks very much, David.
And that's all for now. Please tune in next time. I've been your host, David Benyon, and I'd like to thank my guest, Hamish Greenwood from McGill and Partners. Production was by Peter McGill, and Lawrence Durkin made the music.